So your question might be something like this. Rob, you have shown some internal evidence that the book of Revelation was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. Is there any external evidence for this? Let's talk about that. As we begin this discussion today, we have to ask the question, why is it so important to know the time of the writing of the book? Well, the reason is because if the book is written about the destruction of Jerusalem and the events surrounding it, then it must have been written prior to the event. If it was written after the year AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed, then it has nothing to do with this book whatsoever. So now let's consider the external evidence that the book was written prior to AD 70. This will not by any means be an exhaustive look at this evidence, but an overview of the evidence. For a more detailed description of these events, I will be referring to a book written by Kenneth L. Gentry Jr. entitled Before Jerusalem Fell. Dr. Gentry has solidly documented this in fine detail, and I would like to show why I agree with his conclusions regarding this. Those who say the book of Revelation was written after the destruction of Jerusalem primarily rest their evidence on comments made by Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, who was born in the first half of the 2nd century, or somewhere around 100 years after Christ walked on the earth. His life spans from perhaps 130 AD to about AD 202. As one of the early church fathers, his writings are considered, by many I should say, to be foundational to the early development of Christian theology. He was also acquainted with a person named Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John. So some of the comments of Irenaeus seem to be directly applicable to the dating of the book of Revelation. Irenaeus wrote his famous work entitled Against Heresies to dispute the teachings of the Gnostics, and it is in Book 5 that the question of the time of the writing of Revelation is taken up. Although originally composed in the Greek language, most of the copies did not survive in its original form, although the statement in question upon which the late date advocates rest their conclusion is preserved in the Greek for us in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. For those who profess belief in the later dating of the book of Revelation, the writings of Irenaeus seem to provide them with their most potent information to prove the late date, or that a writing is post AD 70. The words translated in English below are what we find when we search for this statement. I'd like to read this in its entirety. It says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of Antichrist, for if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed at this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, toward the end of Domitian's reign." To say the least, this statement, even when translated in English as done so above, is very vague in its contents. Those who advocate a late date for the writing of the Apocalypse, or Revelation, state that it means that John wrote the Apocalypse toward the end of Domitian's reign. Domitian is said to have reigned from 81 to 96 AD. But the question from this statement is, what exactly was seen toward the end of Domitian's reign? It does not say that the book was written at the end of Domitian's reign. Albert Barnes, in his introduction to the book of Revelation, mentions that this last statement by Irenaeus was a reference to a copy of a book, The Revelation of John. He indicates that this book was seen toward the end of Domitian's reign. So from the way this is phrased, doesn't this seem to indicate the notion that the book was written much earlier? Thus, when Irenaeus said, "For that was seen no very long time since," it finally makes sense that he was referring to a book which had already been written and not to John himself. It should be noted that Irenaeus is also known to have made errant statements throughout his volumes. For example, he is specifically stated as saying Jesus' ministry embraced a period of 10 and even up to 20 years, as noted below in Book 2 of Against Heresies. Please bear with me as I read this, and notice the vague manner in which he stated it. As we begin, it says, "He preached only 1 year, reckoning from his baptism. On completing his 30th year he suffered, being in fact still a young man, who had by no means attained to advanced stage. Now that the first stage of early life embraces 30 years, and that this extends onward to the 40th year, everyone will admit. But from the 40th and 50th year, a man begins to decline toward old age, which our Lord possessed while he was still fulfilled the office of a teacher. Even as the gospel and all the elders testify, those who were conversant in Asia with John, the disciple of the Lord, affirming that John conveyed to them that information. And he remained among them up to the times of Trajan. Some of them, moreover, saw not only John, but the other apostles also, and heard the very same account from them, and bear testimony as to the validity of the statement." Yes, even this passage from Against Heresies is plagued with vague statements, making just exactly what Irenaeus is trying to say difficult to understand. But he certainly appears to be saying that Jesus lived to the age of 40 or 50. When we consider the internal evidence for the dating of the book of Revelation, it is imperative that we consider the seven-headed, ten-horned beast. In Revelation 13:1 it says, "And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names." There have been a great number of commentators who have identified this beast by proclaiming that it is a history lesson which spans several centuries. However, I must reiterate that we must keep in mind that the revelation given to John was given to him for the purpose outlined in the opening verse of the book, and once again in the last chapter of the book. Let's go over these passages once again. Revelation 1:1. "This is what God showed to Jesus Christ, so that he could tell his servants what must happen soon. Christ then sent his angel with a message to his servant John." And in Revelation 1:3 it says, "God will bless everyone who reads this prophecy to others, and he will bless everyone who hears it and obeys it. The time is almost here." And then going to the last chapter of the book, we see it 3 times. It says in Revelation 22:7, "Remember, I am coming soon. God will bless everyone who pays attention to the message of this book." Revelation 22:10 says, "Don't keep the prophecies in this book a secret. These things will happen soon." Revelation 22:12 says, "Then I was told, I am coming soon, and when I come, I will reward everyone for what they have done." Now, from these passages, I would like to ask you a very simple question. Does this sound like it was going to be given to John to speak of events that would take place up to 2,000 years in the distant future? I have mentioned earlier that there have been a great number of commentators who have identified this beast by proclaiming that it is a history lesson which spans several centuries. Specific to the beast outlined in Revelation 13:1 above, there are commentators who would say that this is a reference to 7 world monarchies: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then to some future dynasties hundreds of years into the future. But this cannot be when we consider the purpose as outlined in the opening and the closing of the book. The apostle to whom this revelation was given clearly expects this prophecy to be fulfilled during his lifetime. Why would he imply to these persecuted Christians that they need to think about the history of the world powers and then speculate on future world powers? This would be of absolutely no interest to them. Consequently, we must conclude that this beast outlined in verse 1 of chapter 13 is a first century figure. In the next segment, we'll talk more about this beast, as described in chapter 13, and how we can identify it specifically. Won't you join us for this discussion? Thank you, and have a great day.